Coming from that, it just really transformed my mind to where after that, it was the first time in a long time my brain felt like it was a cohesive unit for myself, that it was not out to get me, that it was not self sabotaging and destroying my life, but instead a vehicle and a holistic part of Jesse. And, that was a pretty sort of amazing experience, which is what led me here today.
Welcome to Psychedelic Diaries. I am Ray Christian, and this episode is going to rev your engine. We'll be discussing another major decriminalization, PTSD and bipartisan support, and of course, experiences on high doses of psychedelics. Jesse Gould, CEO of Heroic Hearts, will be here for a deep dive and a soul search. Our special guest co-host Carlos Plazola is here for another Eagle and the Condor and more. But first, as usual, let's kick things off with a nugget and a noodle. And today's news nugget: British Columbia has decriminalized all drugs. There is a fly in the ointment, though. It won't take effect for another 18 months, and they have a low allowable limit. But nevertheless, another sign of incredible progress. And as for the noodle, something I've been noodling on of late, there is no such thing as a bad trip. But there is a reckoning. When traveling on high doses of psychedelics, you may have some excavating to do. And a face-to-face dance with all your fears and insecurities at an embodied and visceral level isn't exactly the ideal Disney ride. That type of reckoning can be painful and scary, but so can a trip to the dentist. And both are an important part of your health. Two things make the tough trips unpleasant. Number one, you have some rough cleanup work to do, like when Succession's Logan Roy had raccoons in the chimney. Number two, while on a large trip, you will have the adversity skill set of a 10-year-old. Unpleasantness plus the thin skin of a child can result in a tough journey. Plus, it's similar to the dentist. The longer you wait, the more work you may need. But just like when that achy tooth is finally fixed and your pearly whites are squeaky clean, the feeling when you've completed your mental work on a psychedelic trip is wonderful. So how do we reduce the fear of tough trips? Something to noodle on. Speaking of decriminalization, our special guest co-host, the man who sparked the Oakland decriminalization, Carlos Plazola, is here. Mr. Plazola, what's on your mind for today's Eagle and Condor?
Hey, good morning, Ray. It's great to be here. And there's nothing like those tough journeys. How do you get past the fear? I'm not sure you can. Maybe just step right into it. But hey, let's talk about Davos today. So last week was the World Economic Forum. They had a special session at the House of Davos on psychedelics and mental health healing. Primary psychedelic organizations in attendance were sort of representing the Western approach of regulate and control. So that's sort of the EAGLE, as you and I talk about the Eagle and Condor. Reminder for your listeners here: the EAGLE is sort of the Western approach of reductionism and the top-down structure is command and control. It's how we build airplanes. It's how we build computers. Wonderful progress made through all of that. But then the Condor approach is sort of the ancient perspective of plant medicines in this case. So from the perspective of the Condor, what's happening in Davos makes me a little worried about the implications of this because of humans being viewed as a resource to be managed by the global elites rather than as sacred beings to be liberated and enlightened. But Ray, what's your take from the Eagle perspective? Give us condors some hope. Why should I be hopeful about what's happening out there?
Well, I love that you brought up this topic. So to be clear, so it sounds like you're a little bit reticent. You see all these rich, wealthy elites getting together, talking about psychedelics, and it's kind of making spidey senses tingle a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you, what happens when one of the things that happens when people take psychedelics in heavy doses and have those transitions is they start eating better. They start wanting to grow their own food, maybe. They start needing less commodities. And the idea that the global elites would support some of these deep journeys you talked about in your opening statement that might allow that kind of transformation that makes us less eager to buy goods, commodities, products, might send a little anxiety up the food chain to the top. Uh, what's your take on how we ensure that we don't lose the powerful lessons that we can get from psychedelics in the process of commodifying these plant medicines and these psychedelics?
So, two things come to mind. One is this idea that when someone actually does a proper intentional dose, it doesn't really matter what their socioeconomic background is, what kind of ties they have to different tribes, whether that's wealthy elites or more grassroots. They tend to have a feeling of full connectedness. So, the more people that do this, even if it is the wealthy elite, the more the word gets out and good things happen. And the fact that it's in the news, I think, is a good thing. And yeah, they might try to impose some capitalist tendencies. I'm a fan of capitalism personally, but I think the fact that it's there is a good thing because the more people that do it, the better off we are in general. And then the second thought that comes to mind, might be a little bit of a hot take, but it kind of reminds me of that whole MAPS MDMA controversy where that therapist was getting a little bit touchy feely with the one girl and cuddling her and whatever. And for me, like, we're in this bubble of psychedelics and we think, oh, everyone knows it. They don't. A lot of people are outside this and are surprised there even is an industry still. So for me, I think controversy is a good thing. Just like that MAPS sexual controversy, I think that was a good thing for psychedelics. And I think this Davos thing also is a good thing.
I gotta agree with you that controversy is a good thing, and the more people know about psychedelics, a good thing. So, and that's actually why I'm glad you're doing this Eagle and the Condor, because it's good to have these conversations, right? Because I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle of all of this. And the Eagle and the Condor wrapping their wings together and elevating humanity to lead from the heart, but be supported by the mind is an important evolution for us collectively. There's stories, true journalistic stories about DARPA trying to take out the psychedelic or the hallucinogenic experience from psychedelics. And so, my concern is what happens when we get rid of these tough journeys from the psychedelics? Are we left with just numbing and sedation and making us good cogs in the machine? So that's where my concern comes from. I hope that we can make sure we leave heavy doses for people to make those transitions.
Carlos, I love your take on this kind of a contrarian view, making us see different angles to these events that sometimes objectively just look good. And we're like, well, hold on a second. Are these different groups represented? What's the agenda here? So I'm curious for you, what would have made it a 10 out of 10 for you? Is it someone that's from your community, perhaps, that's speaking there? Is it something that's on the conference agenda? What would have gotten you to a point where like, no, this is objectively good for all?
Full support for full decrim without limits. Allowing the plants to be engaged with by humans as we did in ancient times. They're not dangerous. They weren't made illegal because they were dangerous. They were made illegal because of politics and hype. And so if there was conversation about the importance of decrim without limits for these plants, I think that would bring me some level of comfort. It's less about representation of people, more about representation of paradigms.
Mm. Decrim without limits. Okay, we'll keep an eye on that for the next Davos World Economic Forum. Okay, that's it for today's Eagle and the Condor. Time to switch over to the guest spotlight. Our guest today might just be patient X when it comes to the profound impact of psychedelics and military PTSD. He is an Army Ranger veteran and CEO founder of Heroic Hearts. Jesse Gould, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, and I enjoyed the intro section. It's good to see both of you.
Wonderful. Well, let's jump right in. Well, the first thing, Jesse, I just want to say thank you for your service, and also thank you for what you're doing in this industry, being tip of the spear, being a trailblazer. And I saw two quotes from you, and that really jumped out. One was you said, "These compounds have tremendous healing potential when used in an intentional way, and psychedelics can reset you, but if you don't actively add good habits afterwards, then you're wasting a lot of the experience. Jesse, that's really powerful. And I see people engaging in psychedelics intentionally, but they aren't adding new habits. And sometimes all it takes is just one. And I'm curious for you, how do you like to approach adding and incorporating a new habit post journey?
Yeah, well, one of the things we constantly try to emphasize as psychedelics get more popular is there tends to be that sort of skipping to the like, hey, I just need to take psychedelics and everything's going to be a-okay with my life. And so we really try to get out of that magic pill sort of conversation, especially for these guys that have been suffering for so long and they just want some sort of hope. And so that's really what we drive in with our program. We do, preparation. We work with centers that we've worked with before, that we have good relationships, and then the follow up care and all that. And all of it's important. The psychedelic, the experience is one piece of it, but if you don't use that knowledge to actually transform your life, then you're wasting it. And I think we've all seen those people that just kind of get caught in the psychedelic circle where every month, every blah blah blah, every few months, they're just doing the same thing, working on the same things over and over again. And there's, with psychedelics, there's this nice window afterwards where you feel happy, generally speaking, you feel like the obstacles are down. So that's the time, everybody's different. We all need different tools and different psychedelics and all that. So meditation, yoga, breath work, Carlos mentioned earlier, eating healthy. We all know the baseline of what's going to make us good, but it's habit, right? Like anything else, if you stop going to the gym, that first time you go back, it's going to be the hardest thing to get out of bed. But if you do it for 2 weeks, then it becomes easier and easier. And so that's what people need to do to extend and to actually have this being transformational in their lives.
Jesse, if you don't mind a quick tangent, what's a habit that's working for you lately?
For me, there's certain things I cook to keep eating healthy. I try to keep exercising as much as possible. For me, a biggest thing, especially with this nonprofit, like any other startup, is maintaining brain space. Where these are the kind of things that can just overtake it, and then everything becomes work, everything becomes focused on that, and then your relationships, your actual life, your actual habits go on the wayside. And that's everything's a balance, right? Like we need to be balanced in multiple capacities, but it's so easy to become off balance. I'm in New York and you see that all the time with these financial professionals. They do really well, they're 50, and then they're like, oh, what happened to my family and friends, And so for me, that's the biggest thing, staying present, and then planning dates with my wife, reserving weekends when possible to not work, trying to create that brain space, incorporate habits for me that are completely outside the psychedelic realm, So you mentioned that bubble too, we all get caught up in that. And so trying to give myself space from even that so I can also be a more effective leader to see what's happening on the outside as well as what we think's happening on the inside of this bubble.
Oh, I love that. Appreciate the peek behind the curtain. So, Jesse, stepping back a little bit to the big picture of what you're working on, the big stat with PTSD and with veterans is obviously 22 suicides a day. And we see now some potentially profound impacts with psychedelics. And I'm curious for you, you could probably make the case that veteran PTSD is the reason that we see bipartisan political support for psychedelics, all the way from Maryland and Oregon down to Texas. Jesse, what does success look like for psychedelics and veterans?
So it's one piece of it. We have found the veteran voice to be particularly powerful, especially we are fortunate as veterans that we get unilateral support from both sides, at least on the surface. Sometimes it's just kind of more to get elected, but we're gonna use that to push it forward. Um, and so success for me, I think we all know, like, it's beautiful that psychedelics are getting more accepted and that, we're understanding more about it. But we also know that it's not sustainable in terms of our mental health systems already at capacity. And even if they're all sort of in terms of programs that help people with mental health, it's not feasible for every single veteran with PTSD to go to a clinic one on one and get psilocybin. The economic situation doesn't encourage that. So I think we need to look, back. We need to look humbly from where these ceremonies, these substances come from, the origins, the elders, the indigenous healers. And what they always did is they supported the community. It was a localized level, it was a small level. And oftentimes it didn't even need the psychedelic, it was just the healer themselves. And so the only way in my mind that in the future this is going to be sustainable on a vast mental health scale is if we bring it down back to the community. I think we've our communities have been ravaged, especially with COVID and with the social media. And so in the future, I want a veteran to be able to go to the VA and have effective MDMA care, or go if somebody's feels more comfortable with a doctor doing psilocybin. I think they should have that capacity. But I also want the ability for community circles that have psilocybin or whatever modality, but it being out in the open, which increases safety, which increases a conversation. So I know I can go to this veteran group and that healer, I know I can trust them. I know where they kind of came from. I know these facilitators, and creating this closed ecosystem too, where then other veterans can then, work with that group and pay forward. With our program, we already have veterans that come back, become coaches, and then help others, which then just helps themselves as well. So we need to really, we lost that center of community. And I do think psychedelics, with the guidance of these traditions of how they originated, should be sort of the guidepost of how we can actually make a more expansive mental health system.
Right on. Hey, Jesse, I really love your focus on community. I think that's where we all come together and meet. All people, all incomes, all races, all religions come together in community. So appreciate that focus, and I really appreciate your work, Jesse. You're a good brother. Supporting veterans is important. My our grandpa Sal, my Uncle Joe, Uncle Paul were in World War II. My brother was in the Navy 15 years. My niece and nephew served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Last winter, I lost a good brother, Nathan, to suicide after he did a couple tours in Afghanistan, and he just saw some dark stuff. And so really honor your work. My role here with Ray, and I really appreciate what Ray does here, is an opportunity to build bridges between the communities that I come from, which is indigenous, immigrant, urban communities of color. Um, and one of the things that I've recognized, and one of the things that I struggle with, is that this country rightfully honors veterans of American foreign wars. We often stigmatize families and communities that are ravaged by the war on drugs, war on melanin, war on immigrants, First Peoples. And plant medicine, though, teaches us that each of us is sacred and worthy of living our highest life. So, I often wonder, what can revered veteran leaders like yourself do to support families and communities that have suffered under these stigmatized wars? How can you help folks, or what can leaders like yourself do to ensure that these communities have a voice in policy formulation around oftentimes medicines that were their own, their ancestral sacred plants?
Absolutely, and great question. And I think you kind of tapped into it at the beginning, is, these conversations and then kind of coming together, even if we have disagreements of how can we push this forward. It's not just about one group, one race of pushing this forward. And we also have to, as we step forward, make sure we respect where it's coming from and make sure it's not exploitative. So when we work with centers, we want to make sure that the healers are, it's not just, like turn out, here's your money, turn out more. We want to make sure that they like working with veterans and they want to work with us. The beauty and one of the reasons ayahuasca is at the center of our program is because not only it's such a powerful and beautiful psychedelic, but also veterans have to go to these spots where it comes from and work with healers, work with indigenous villages and communities, and see sort of that the Western perspective is not everything. And I think that gives them the appreciation that, maybe the Western model has some improvements and some humility, as opposed to just, and nothing wrong with that, but as opposed to just taking LSD in a basement, it's the psychedelic, and there's not that community appreciation sort of piece. And we are, actively working of like, what can we do more? We're a small nonprofit, and it's an overwhelming burden, just the number of veterans. So we're trying to do all that stuff, but respectfully and sustainably. And so, there are movements and talks of, for instance, bringing people to villages that want it, not just sort of tourism kind of thing, but like interact with Shipibo villages or all that. And I think that's part of it. That education. There's such an opportunity because psychedelics open your mind up so much that if we appropriately teach these veterans that we work with that sort of appreciation and that history of where this comes from and other perspectives, even if they don't agree with why they think the mechanisms are working, just opening their minds to that. I think that starts the baseline, and we are in this early stage, as you mentioned. There's this war on drugs has been devastating. My wife's Colombian, so there's a very poignant tie to that, and I've seen living there, some of the devastation still to this day. And it's something we do have to talk about. It is something that we have to recognize, and it's also something we have to move forward from. I was just at a great veteran event by my friend Andrew Marr, and we were fortunate enough. It was sort of a running race for veterans, and they had invited Chief Lane, who is representative of a lot of Native American voices, and him and some other Native American elders were there and did ceremony and supported us, and we all communicated. And one of his powerful messages is, there is obviously that bloody past there with the U.S. and Native tribes, but he was just like, hey, especially us as warriors, we have to figure out a way to move together forward. That's, our archetype is that protector, the servers. And so I'm hopeful that these veterans that come into this healing use that same force and use that same energy to change the narrative, change their perspective. But that starts with their healing, and that starts with education and, working with people like you in the community and having these conversations. The eagle and condor, right? So having both sides of it.
Right on, brother. Thank you for that work, and that bridge building you're talking about is so important. And again, I want to honor Ray here for having the courage to have these deep conversations. It's not a lot of people having these out there in the greater psychedelic world where we challenge each other. And he and I, we don't agree on everything, but in that disagreement is where that fertile soil lies of new problem solving. And so you and I were both involved in SB 519, and Decrim Nature didn't agree with setting the limits. For us, the danger of setting the limits on entheogens, particularly for natural persons, is that marginalized people could potentially go to jail for growing, gathering, gifting. And SB 519, for the listeners who don't know, is the Senate bill in California that would decriminalize entheogens and psychedelics. And so we're just concerned that that setting the limits would over time cause people to go to jail. And so again, the veteran community in the United States is very powerful, bipartisan. That's beautiful for the psychedelic movement. And so what can folks do who have that influence to ensure that as more psychedelic legalization policies in the U.S. pass, that corporate lobbyists don't keep reducing limits on how much people can grow, gather, gift, in order to make more and more profits and putting people at risk in already at-risk communities. And we see this happening in cannabis, where we have cultivation limits being set, where we see grow, gather, gift under siege now by corporate lobbyists in a few states. What do you think can be done?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just being conscientious leaders. It's like you said, like it's definitely on my radar, and it's definitely something I like. Ray, I see the benefits of capitalism, but I also can see the destructive power of it. And so, friends who have been in the cannabis industry, I know can get overrun by sort of corporate interests now. And I'm hopeful that people are learning, but I know, as with everything, there's multiple forces coming into this. For ourselves, that's one of the things when we are a part of some of these movements. We want to make sure that there is sort of a communal consideration, communal access side of these bills, because that's, for me, at the ground level, representing veterans. It's all about that community. It's all about the ceremony. It's all about gathering them together. So if it's just personal possession, that doesn't help. It helps. It definitely moves it forward, but not to the way that we can encourage people to help heal themselves and be in communities and local areas. With SB 519, and I know there's been disagreements. There's been some controversy. There's been conflict, and I understand it. And for me personally, where it stands now, it's not perfect by any means, but I do think it does move forward. And from the conversations I've had with local representatives, it's sort of the question in my mind right now is this possible? And if it's not possible, is this acceptable? And is it in the long run going to help in terms of psychedelics, in terms of increasing access to people who drastically need it? So, if I had my druthers, no limits. But from the representatives I talked to, it just wouldn't get passed if we didn't have that. That was such a stickler. There's some other things that was just like, that's the wall, that's the wall. And so you have to make that hard decision of like, do we scrap this? Do we wait another 5, 10 years until this comes around, or is this going to push forward in a way that I still think will be overall positive? And there are the limits on there, but if it's personal limits, but then it also can be multiplied for group. So, for instance, psilocybin with 10 people, you can have 10 times whatever the legal limit or the restriction, and that's a lot of psilocybin. I know it's still putting limits and it has that precedent, but right now the limits are very high, and it still allows for that community in terms of the provisions. So, I mean, it's tricky with this stuff. There's language, there's some vagaries just for either purposeful or just because it's the nature of it. From what you're saying, just in terms of what can we do, I think it's just being conscientious of what we are a part of and push back. So we have pushed back on certain things as much as possible, but then also you know uh, figuring out, and this is my estimation, and I'm open to people who disagree with it, but I do think where it stands now, it does help move this forward, and will potentially, if it passes, help veterans that are in the local area get more healing or quicker access to healing.
Right on, Jesse. I appreciate that response. I do hope, next time we could take a little bit more time to do more education of our elected officials to help them understand the issue better. But I would love to stand guard, arm in arm with you, a couple warriors, to make sure that if it does pass, that we get less and less limits and not more and more limits put on people. So look forward to working with you in the future.
Absolutely. And if people, start, as we gain more of a reputation and hopefully respect in both the veteran and psychedelic and hopefully political world too, we'll be the first ones to call out bad players and missteppers, and,
Mm.
it's, I come from this out of sincerity. I want to help the veterans. I want to do it respectfully to where it comes from. And I want it to be, like I said, if anything sort of derails this sort of access to community, access to local levels, that goes against everything that we stand for. So that's, what we're trying to push forward.
It's such a fascinating debate. On one side, I think to myself, okay, well, it's like Confucius said, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And getting anything through, if it's progress, that's good. On the other hand, like I've grown mushrooms myself, and actually at a certain point, you would have to stop the grow. Otherwise, I'd be exceeding the legal limit because it's not that hard to grow them. And so it's a tough one, and it's just a good example of just why they say watching laws get made is like watching a sausage get made. It is unpleasant, but I appreciate both sides of the argument. Jesse, switching gears a little bit, um, I had an experience, a big experience, and I'll kick it to you afterwards. I'd love to hear your take on one mystical experience. For me, I had one recently on 3.5 grams of mushrooms where it felt like I visited my 37-year-old mother, and she's obviously older now and battling illness, and but it was like seeing like the elite avatar, the ideal version of her when she was in her prime, and she was she was parenting 3 kids, single mother, juggling that with a job, and just stressed out, and but just seeing her at her just mental peak in a way, and just able to sit with her. And I don't know if it was time travel, like hopping in the DeLorean with Michael J. Fox, but it was like 4K HD. Like I was fucking there with her and was able to send her warmth and love and it was really nice. And I'm curious for you. You've had some deep journeys, uh, Jesse. What's a mystical experience that still resonates with you?
I mean, I always, I think, like many people, it comes to the first one. It's the pre. the pre-ayahuasca life versus the post-ayahuasca life. My first ceremony is ayahuasca was my first psychedelic, and so I just went into it, and it was just all out war and chaos, and it was just the first two and a half ceremonies were. I didn't know if I was going to survive it. I didn't know if I was going to keep my sanity afterwards, but obviously that was the fear, anxiety coming up. But then through it, after suffering and just like what's going on and puking throughout the night, this hand reached out and pulled me through this sort of like plant portal. And then all of a sudden I was just chill, like physiologically changed, temperature changed, heart rate, breath, all just completely calm, completely in Zen mode. And as the mind does, as it self sabotages, instantly my mind was like, oh, but what if? And then the moment I did that, I went back to the hellscape. And so the rest of that night was like back and forth, back and forth. But then, and that was a training. It eventually, I got it, or I just stopped resisting, right? And then was able to stay in that peaceful zone, was able to just like not self sabotage, not destroy myself with anxiety. And then that's when it opened up. And then that's when I was just in this plane. I was I felt like I was a bear with other bears and just other random sort of things. But it was just the feeling, right? It was just that serenity, peace after struggling for so long. And coming from that, it just really transformed my mind to where after that, it was the first time in a long time my brain felt like it was a cohesive unit for myself, that it was not out to get me, that it was not self sabotaging and destroying my life, but instead a vehicle and a holistic part of Jesse. And, that was a pretty sort of amazing experience, which is what led me here today.
That's beautiful. This idea of getting pulled through the plant portal, that is just fucking cool. Jesse, if you don't mind, one quick little bonus question. This idea of sometimes I think that anxiety, depression, mental illness, it almost feels like in a way a mental form of obesity, where it's like it's a state of unhealthiness, and you can get healthy. And I don't know if there's a cure for it, because you can, if you become obese, you can get fit, but then if you lose your weight, you can become obese again. I don't know if cure is the right word with things like this, with mental issues, but it does feel similar. And I'm curious for you, because you are this walking, talking paragon of veterans and psychedelics. Do you feel like PTSD? Are you at baseline because of psychedelics? Maybe not cured isn't the word, but do you feel like, no, I'm good now?
I feel like you get more tools. Like the trauma in your past is always there. And like you said, like obesity, or I always, when we talk to people, we almost relate it to addiction. Like if you go back in your old patterns, then you're going to go right back into all this old trauma. And we are somewhat addicted to the trauma, like
Mm.
it's easy to fall back. If your thing's alcoholism, it's easy to like, oh, just one more beer tonight. Oh, just one without that discipline. And so it's a work in progress.
That's a good time to transition to the speed round. Soul Search, a wonderful deep dive. Okay, Jesse, question number one. Kind of a cheat, two parts in this one question. What's your favorite movie and your favorite musical artist?
I'd say my favorite movie always growing up is Harvey. It's an old one with James Stewart. He imagines a fake tall rabbit, which I guess is very appropriate for this work. Music artist, I was always old school, so Frank Sinatra, especially a respect for my dad.
Sinatra. Love that. Okay, question number two, Jesse. How has your military experience made you a better CEO?
The military one, it just really allows you to understand yourself like nothing else, because you're put through the challenges, and then you learn leadership by fire. You have to be an effective leader, and I think that's not something you can learn in school.
Question number three, Jesse. What is the hardest part of high dose psychedelic journeys?
For me, it's just letting go. To this day, it's always a Bronco, but it's to everybody else. They all have their own thing, but it's just letting go and trusting.
That really resonates with me. Okay, question number four, final question. Jesse, who is one person that has had a dramatic impact on your career?
I would say my wife, Anna. Met her post ayahuasca. Before I couldn't hold down a good relationship. was healthier myself, found somebody who could build up my life, and she's just been supportive nonstop since.
Oh, thank you for that vulnerable share. Jesse, where can the viewers find you?
So they can go to heroicheartsproject.org. We're on Instagram, Heroic Hearts Project. If you have any questions, you're a veteran, you want to sign up, the website, or reach out on Heroic Hearts. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, so any support is always more than welcome. It helps us send more vets.
Okay, we'll get those notes in the description. Jesse, you were an excellent guest. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure, both Ray and Carlos. Great conversation, so I appreciate you both.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, be sure to go check out the Heroic Hearts website and consider donating to their wonderful cause. Next week, Rebecca Nicholson, founder of 5D Capital, will be joining. Go support Carlos and the decriminalization movement at decriminalizenature.org. And come join me at the psilocybin soiree to chat with other solo explorers. Hey, Carlos, any parting thoughts for the guests?
No, that was a great show. Jesse's a good dude, Ray. I really enjoyed that episode, and again, appreciate you bringing this different perspective into the conversation. So, right on.
Well put. Thank you for watching this episode of Psychedelic Diaries. For Jesse Gould and Carlos Plazola, I'm Ray Christian. See you next time.